Hey everybody, this is Suri Guramurthy, and I wanted to give you a really brief overview of, or a review, if you will, of the topics that we have covered thus far in the class. And starting with, so we'll cover about 6 or 7 major topics, and I'll be brief and I'll cover some of the key highlights, some of the key takeaways from all the various different modules. Okay. And so the very first week we discussed a case example relating to the COVID 19 pandemic and what we can learn about decision making, and in particular, crisis decision making. And we talked about, in particular, not only global issues, but in particular, US issues. And so we talked about the timeline and how the testing issues were at the root of some of these problems. Early crisis signals were ignored, and furthermore, or even if they were recognized, there was some hesitancy and also some difficulty in responding to those early crisis signals. And the fact that there were multiple crises, one in the hospitals, but then also the transmission, which is still ongoing. And still today, 50, 60,000 people are still reporting positive infections for COVID 19. And we also talked about the psychology issues, how people respond emotionally to issues as opposed to looking at it from a rational perspective, so called rational, and considering various different alternatives in place, how emotions have a strong role to play in how people respond to crises, and the economic issues, how that also hurts people side by side. And so the key takeaways were, what kind of model can we think of that would be useful as an overarching framework to respond to crises, especially in large or small organizations, even at the level of governments. And so the most critical being leadership and a sense of direction. Why are we engaging in these crisis response efforts, and what is the overall strategy? And so, if you combine leadership and direction together, you have what's known as strategy, commitment, and ownership and responsibility. And of course, many countries have shown the relevance and importance of such leadership and strategy. And then you also have to have some cognitive diversity. What does this mean? You must seek out different sources of information. You must also seek out different perspectives, and you must also seek out different problem solving techniques. And because it's a crisis, and there are a lot of unknown variables, one must be ready to deploy different problem solving techniques on a fairly quick basis based on the feedback. And then, especially as we talked about some of these quote unquote emotional, or even some would argue non scientific or irrational reactions. And so the perfect antidote to that is critical thinking, asking the hard questions. Why are we here? Why are we facing these problems? Gather the data. And I showed you how it's possible to gather the data where infections are spreading, testing, tracing, isolating, and furthermore, test the logic and the rationality of the arguments, okay, one way or the other. And one must be able to do this fairly quickly. And in other words, deploy system one in many cases, and hopefully your system one responses are fairly well honed, and they are working well. And also, you must evaluate potential solutions again fairly quickly. Okay, and of course, here you see the need for combination of system one and system two, but the key piece being that there's a role of experts. Okay, and so experts, their system one reactions are typically better than the layperson system one responses. Okay, and so if you think about organizational model for crisis decision making, as we said, the leader is responsible for setting the strategy, whoever he or she is. And then the organization is also responsible to give inputs to the leader, and furthermore also provide the data about the system. and together they experience the crisis context. In other words, they undergo the experience of the crisis, and eventually it kind of boils down to three or four different ways of decision making or frameworks of decision making. So the first being rational analytic, which means classic system two, where you break down a problem, analysis, solve smaller problems, and then correlate it to how you would solve the bigger problem. That's the rational analytic approach. And also, you tend to remove the subjectivity out of it. You react based on data. And so, what we would consider classic system two. And then there's also the satisficing approach, where it is very complex. There are many, many stakeholders involved. And so, therefore, we might need this approach called satisficing, which is we can't satisfy everyone. Therefore, we must satisfy the minimum requirements as far as possible of all the stakeholders. And then a third approach is Kahneman's approach, which is says that human beings typically tend to deploy heuristics to solve small and, in particular, crisis problems. And furthermore, human beings always carry bias based on their past beliefs and based on their past experiences. And so, therefore, one way to improve the decision making is to constantly improve those heuristics, those shortcut ways of solving complex problems, and furthermore, recognize those biases and be prepared for those biases, and maybe even some cases use them to our advantage, whereby we can systematically learn and very quickly so that we have the right belief systems when the crisis arrives or even during the crisis. Okay? And then lastly, there's the naturalistic decision making framework or NDM approach, which relies on experts. Okay, and so this framework is built around building expertise and recognizing expertise. Who are the experts who can help us solve the crisis? Okay, and giving them the right tools, giving them the right data, and that's the naturalistic decision making model in a nutshell. And very important is to look at the early outcomes and then feed that back. In other words, we learn from our successes and failures in a crisis, and then those become the guide to improvement or to eventually overcoming the crisis. Okay, so we quickly look for good directions of improvement, and if that doesn't pan out, then we go back and come up with other ways to solve the problems. Okay, and this happens very quickly. The velocity of the environment is fairly high in a crisis, and that's what we call a fast evolving crisis. And so, lastly, these two theories essentially dominate in many, many organizations, especially in political environments. And so, one is, or even government organizations. So, one is Gary Klein, which is the NDM approach, where the belief is that experts are the right ones to make the good decisions during a crisis, let's say, and they do so by pattern matching. If you remember generic problems, first exposure, is this a unique problem? And so they're able to recognize what type of issues it is, what type of problem it is. And then you have recognition primed, where experts they are trained to look for those early warning signals, and then that triggers appropriate responses. Now, the criticism is this is suited mainly for environments that are more stable and perhaps not for kind of unique events or even a first exposure to a generic problem. Okay, and so in the more experts have thought about this, they feel like the COVID pandemic is but one of many pandemics that has affected us through our history, but it is a first exposure in the sense that we do not have the antidote, we do not have the vaccines to this particular strain of the virus. Okay, and so that makes it a generic problem, but a first exposure. Okay, it's not a unique event, and by the way, we've always had pandemics every few decades. The SARS, first coronavirus from 2003 that affected China and Greater China, including Hong Kong. And then there's the opposing theory, which is Daniel Kahneman's theory, which for a long time they were at loggerheads, where Daniel Kahneman believed that really it comes down to heuristics and biases, even of experts, and that experts are prone to errors. And sometimes the experts make big mistakes. Okay. And what are some reasons? They get anchored to the first piece of data. They solve the wrong problem using attribute substitution or deploying attribute substitution. There's an illusion of confidence that we know best. They do not take into account different sources of information, different sources of problem solving techniques, and finally the illusion of knowledge, that we understand everything about the interaction between the crisis, between our solution, and between the different elements of the system. Okay, and there's the illusion that's called the illusion of knowledge, that we really understand everything about a system, and in fact we may not. Okay, and so biases are everywhere. Individuals are also biased, and these were some of the key takeaways from the first case example. Okay, so the next kind of let me just pull to the right slides. So the next kind of topic we discussed was a little bit digging deeper into not just organizational decision making in the context of a crisis, but also how individuals may make decisions at times other than in times of crisis. In other words, in generic circumstances, generic kind of problem settings, how do people make decisions, collective versus the individual? And so we sliced it and diced it different ways. We looked at different causal factors, or the antecedents, what we call antecedents of decision making. And so a simple idea there is decisions can be made either for the long term or the short term. And on the other hand, they could either be individually made or collectively made. And when it's made, for example, for long term, and when it's made by a group for a group, that's what we call long-term policy. Policy means it applies to all the stakeholders in the group, and furthermore, it applies for different circumstances. In other words, over the long term. Okay. Now you could also have short-term policy where it's collectively made, so it does apply to everyone in the group, but the policy is short-lived. Okay, and so it's not necessarily going to hold for a long term, but short-term policy. And then, of course, at the individual level, even people might make long-term decisions regarding their careers, regarding marriage, regarding friendships. Okay, or they could engage in short-term decision making on an individual basis. Similarly, you can think about the locus of control. What's the locus of control? It is to what extent you believe you have impact on others. And very often, if we don't believe we have a lot of impact on others, and even otherwise, we might engage in self-interested behavior, where on the other hand, if we think we have an impact on others in our surroundings, in our communities, in our workplaces, and then we make decisions on their behalf, that's what we call altruistic. Okay, and of course here we can also think about independent decision making by individuals in any culture, in any society, versus hierarchical, where it's top down. Okay, and then, of course, when it's altruistic and independent, that's what we call liberal democratic, where it's mainly decisions, or I shouldn't say all, but the culture is that of decision making, not only for ourselves, but also for the communities. Okay, and taking care of our community as much as we take care of ourselves. And that's actually set up as a culture of decision making. On the other hand, you can also have self-interested and independent, which is what we call capitalistic, where it's a land of opportunity, or let's say, or you're welcome to make your own living, you're welcome to make your own decisions regarding your life, regarding your work, regarding your business, regarding how we interact with the broader community. And that's the capitalistic environment or culture. And then, of course, you have dictatorial. If it's hierarchical and self-interested, then it's the interest of the main decision makers. Now, we might think it's only political. No. In fact, most corporate structures are set up as dictatorial, in the sense that especially even privately owned companies, where the owners they make decisions for their own best interest, and if it happens to intersect with the interests of the employees, well and good. But there's no kind of questioning the fact that decisions are made for the interest of the stakeholders, for example, the shareholders, or even the senior management, and so on. And then, of course, you have the socialistic kind of culture or enterprise where it's hierarchical, but it's also altruistic. Okay, and similarly, you can cross whether individuals and decision makers are motivated, as in they want to do certain things, versus are they forced to engage in certain decisions. And then compare that with whether they're doing this for intangible gain, which is a higher level need. If you remember, we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People progress to higher levels of need, social status, belonging, community, contributing back to the community. Those are higher level needs, as opposed to shelter, income, basic income, and security, safety. Those are lower level needs. And then, so some of these lower level needs, we call them tangible gains. Okay, tangible gains. And so if it's motivated for tangible gain, typically we want to grow our assets, we want to grow our wealth. On the other hand, if it is motivated, but then it's intangible gain, we're doing this for self-worth, okay, some higher level need, and from a psychological perspective. On the other hand, if it's forced and intangible, then we are essentially maintaining our social status, and we don't want to look bad, let's say, simply put. On the other hand, if it's forced and for tangible gain, then we are forced to make certain decisions to maintain our assets, and that's about it. Okay. And similarly, you can engage in repetitive decisions versus sporadic decisions, one-off, off the cuff. Okay, and where sometimes it's predictable or unpredictable. And if it's repetitive and predictable, those are seasonal and cyclical decisions. I gave many examples in class. On the other hand, if it is repetitive and unpredictable, that's volatile. Okay, and so what do people do when they lose, right, or when the economy is bad? We can't exactly predict when the economy will be bad. Okay, and so that's unpredictable, and then people behave in volatile ways. Okay, they panic, let's say. Okay, and but those are still repetitive. The economy is going to go through a boom or bust cycle. Okay, and exactly when it's going to happen, you can't predict. On the other hand, every year you have Christmas, every year you have Thanksgiving, let's say in the US, or Chinese New Year, or Mid Autumn Festival. We make certain decisions in predictable ways, and those are seasonal, or even where the cycles are more predictable. You can also think of them as cyclical decisions. Okay, and on the other hand, if it's sporadic and predictable, that's reflex. You know how you're going to react. Okay, and there's no doubt about that. That's called reflexive decision. On the other hand, you can also engage in highly unpredictable decision making, which is like a shock response. Okay, and again, there are several examples of that. Okay, so these are some important antecedents of decisions, and then in the discussion in the modules and also in the video lecture, I talk about some of these different kind of broader examples of how individual decision making relate to big policy decisions and vice versa. Okay, how they can be reinforcing to form a culture. Okay, good. So the next topic, then, the next set of ideas we discussed was from a psychological perspective, and this is from a psychological perspective how people have studied decision making as a process. Okay, and this is where we introduce Kahneman's framework of System 1 versus System 2, which is really a collaboration between Gary Klein and Kahneman. They collaborated on a series of papers together, and they said, okay, it's not mutually exclusive. Experts, they tend to engage in more System 2 over time, and then they bring that part as a part of their System 1. Whereas, so where experts may have intuition, their System 1 is much more powerful. Okay, their intuitions are much more targeted, and so that's why we, we worship the experts. We celebrate them. We pay them well. Okay, and then of course Kahneman's theory around biases and heuristics. Okay, and so now together they came up with this framework of system one versus system two, and see how, taken together, they would explain a lot of different decision making contexts, okay, from a psychological perspective. And we discussed some classic illusions, and how there's actually systematic bias and anchoring in our decision making. For example, here's, if you remember in class, I'd asked you, do you see dolphins? And many of you said you didn't see dolphins, okay? And why don't we see dolphins? Because we are conditioned, as we become mature, sexually mature, we're conditioned to look at, right, the sexual nature of the picture, and so the man and woman together, and so we can't see the dolphins. Okay, so the first imagery is so powerful that it precludes us and prevents us from looking and observing the dolphins, whereas a child may very easily look at the dolphins first. Okay, because they are not sexually conditioned, and so that's an example of how we get anchored and conditioned by our past experiences. Okay, we get anchored to those belief systems and to those kind of images, and to those kind of ways of thinking. Okay, and so we discussed several examples of anchoring. Okay, bat and a ball example. How much does it cost the bat? How much does it cost the ball? Okay, and so these are questions. Typically, system one is typically what leads us into that rabbit hole of bias. Okay, and also quick shortcuts like heuristics. Okay, so quickly we say, oh, $1 plus 10 cents is $1.10, and so therefore the bat must cost $1, the ball must cost 10 cents. But really, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball, $1 is just 90 cents more than 10 cents. Okay, so that's an example of how bias and heuristics come together and lead us to an incorrect answer. Okay, and of course, an expert won't do that. That's the point. Some experts would, if they are doing this on a casual basis, if they are very easy. But if they're really solving this as a specific math problem, if you were doing this for an exam or you're trying to deploy algebra, it's hard to get it wrong. Okay, and that's the point where system one and system two, you can see both pictures. Okay, when we want to solve it carefully, we are able to. But when we don't want to solve it carefully, then we engage in system one. Okay, and so system one, it's not necessarily emotional. It's just faster processing, limited information processes, uses more memory and past beliefs. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, and takes more effort and also resources in the form of glucose, and seeks out more and newer information, up-to-date information. Okay, and so the point is, Gary Klein NDM model and Kahneman, the heuristics and bias model, they came together and said, okay, this is starting to look more like two systems that are working. Okay, so neither of them are wrong, neither of them are 100% correct either. So really, it's how we use our system one and system two engines, okay, or processes that are happening in our brains. And system one relies more on intuitions and impulses. System two actually does accept some of these suggestions and intuitions. It may reject some of those, okay, but it takes that as input. And it does also rely on belief, because we can't have perfect memory. We need to replace all of our deep memory with beliefs, okay. And system two does engage in voluntary actions because it's slower, as opposed to system one, which engages more in impulses. Okay, so neither of them is perfect, neither of them is always better. Okay, of course, we like to think that system two is better, and there is a case to be made for that, where in all of civilization, you can think of it as a gradual movement towards system two. Yes, so we can make a statement that system two is generally, if you deploy it with perfect information, it is better. But the problem is we don't always have perfect information, so we will go back to system one. So the right way to think about it is a combination of system one, well-trained system one, and supported by system two decision making is probably the best mode of decision making. Okay, So in other words, what we can take away is neither of them is necessarily superior than the other, but a combination of these two supporting each other, that often adds much more value. Okay, and and so here's an example of how system 2 might fail. Okay, and system 2 gets tired. That's why I say system 2 is not perfect. And we looked at this concept of ego depletion, which was, they tried to prove it using this parole judge's study, and how the default was always denial. And so before releasing a prisoner, you have to be completely sure that they're not going to be a threat to society. And what they found is that after the meals, the approval rates went up significantly. And just before a meal, nobody was getting approved. Okay, and so in other words, the judges were reluctant to use their system 2, even though they were well-trained judges. Okay, and system 1 also operates based on priming. This is what we call intuition, and priming is what triggers that intuition. Okay, and that's priming. It's the associative engine, and so where we connect the new information with our memories, emotions, etc. And the problem is that these associations, they could be conditioned in imperfect ways. And a classic example being, hey, this picture. So that's classic association for you. Okay, so you see that image and it triggers the right, um, the sexual conditioning, and then you say, okay, I can't see the dolphins. And so if you do this often enough, you might have heard of brainwashing, right? You see, do this often enough, and it becomes part of our system 1, and so we just we don't even recognize that this association is so strong because of past experiences, because of past information. And like we said, system 1 is also susceptible to cognitive ease. So the minute we are more comfortable, we start to make mistakes. Why is that? Because association is so much easier, and this happens with clear visuals, repeated visuals or repeated information, and feeling of familiarity. When it feels good, when it feels true, then we feel cognitively at ease, and then we tend to engage system 1. Okay, and then some of those decisions are actually mistakes, many of them. Okay. On the other hand, system 2 is typically triggered when we are not elated, we are not cognitively at ease, but there's some cognitive discomfort, vigilance, suspicion, skepticism, and so on. Okay, and so typically these are the triggers for system 2. And so system 1 is not aware of ambiguity. Just because it's impulsive, you just make the decisions without even realizing it. Okay, and evolutionarily there's a reason for this. Okay, but that's the first order decision making. In the system 2, then hopefully that you go back and see, okay, am I making this decision the right way? Have I accounted for all the uncertainty, the risk? And ambiguity is just uncertainty about the objectives, whereas not clear. Okay, why we're making the decision, and also this lack of clarity. That's ambiguity. Risk, on the other hand, or uncertainty, is we don't know, whereas ambiguity is lack of clarity as to the objectives or as to the data itself. Okay, and whether we have enough data, we're not so clear. Okay, and so there's another related concept called thin slicing, which is the basis of system 1, where we only look at a small section of the data, because our brain can't process all the data at once to make quick decisions. Okay, and then overall, if you combine all these different ideas that we've discussed so far together, you could be making decisions for utilitarian gains or psychological gains, also to avoid losses, and not just for ourselves but for others. And oftentimes we have to engage in a specific decision process that includes alternatives and comparison of those alternatives, feedback. And then after that, we still experience regret or satisfaction. We might undergo post-decisional crisis. And what are some of our responses? We may double down, we may curtail our implementation of the decision if you're not so sure. And so this is typically kind of an overall process from a psychological perspective. That's what's different about this topic. Is here we are looking at decision making processes from a information processing and psychological perspective. Okay, from the perspective of psychology. And then very quickly we discussed this simple framework that I came up with. Says, okay, what's the most important element, whether system one or system two? It's the process. Okay. Oftentimes, if you want to see how effective decision making has been, system one, in fact, when we evaluate decisions, system one might immediately start looking at the outcomes. Or was it good or bad? But then the better way to really judge a process, if you engage system two evaluation methods, you might find that it's actually the process, okay, that's either good or bad, okay. And outcomes, because of the element of risk, you might have a perfectly sound process, logical process, but hey, it just didn't work out. You had a brilliant idea, it just didn't work out, or you made the right effort, it didn't work out, okay. So that's possible. Okay. On the other hand, you could have a flawed process and you might still end up with good outcomes because of the risk. Okay. And so we also tried to quantify what do we mean by risk. And if you remember, we said risk equals uh, the likelihood of the outcome multiplied by the value of the outcome. Okay. And so that's the risk. And so there's two kinds of risk: upside risk, which is an opportunity, good things may happen, or downside risk, which is a threat, bad things may happen. Okay. But either way, how to quantify it? What's the probability of that event happening multiplied by what's the value of that outcome or that event? Okay. So why do we separate out the value? Because let's say that you double your salary, but it may not be worth as much to you because most of your income may be coming from outside of your job, maybe real estate. Okay. So we might not associate the same value to the same outcomes. We might not associate the same value to the same outcomes, okay, as decision makers over time or as individual different decision makers. And so we discussed how alternatives, you need to develop those alternatives as part of typically system two decision making, and how you can map out from the decision through the alternatives to possible outcomes. If you don't consider alternatives, you might not even encounter certain outcomes. That's the importance of looking at different alternatives and where outcomes may not be perfectly measurable, okay, or observable. And we discussed some examples of that. And so here's the quantification of risk: probability of outcome multiplied by the value of the outcome. And if the value is positive and there's a reward associated, then the risk is considered an opportunity. If it's negative, risk is considered a threat. Excuse me. And in terms of the process, a lot of the process is how we manage information, because decision making, success or failure, depends on how well we process that information. Okay. And by the way, objective is not necessarily better than subjective. And so you might need a combination of both emotions, experience, judgment, as well as data to eliminate the bias and deploying sound logic. So combination of these elements leads to, in your process, leads to uh, a well-rounded process. That's what we call a well-rounded process, right? Where it's not just purely rational, where we're ignoring the emotions and the experience and the judgment, nor is it completely reliant on the elements on the right. Okay. And so let's see. And then, so when is it a good idea to engage in forward reasoning? You can think that in some cases you may not be able to observe all these outcomes. They may not be measurable, in which case you're forced to kind of start from the decision and then look at the alternatives and then hope for the best outcomes from those alternatives, because you can't be sure. Okay, so just like we can't be sure choosing a major how it's going to work out, because we don't have that much experience or ability to observe the outcomes 30 years down the road or 20 years down the road. Okay, so that would be an example of how system two might force you to engage in first considering the alternatives, and then hopefully these alternatives will lead to the outcomes that you desire. On the other hand, backward reasoning, typically then what happens is Either you're able to observe the outcomes, then once having observed the potential outcomes, you really desire it, and then you want it, and then that kind of leads the entire process. And so from the desired outcomes, there's a bias that kicks in, and then you work your way back to the alternatives that will get you to those outcomes, and then you make your decision. This is also possible. Let's say the starting salaries, as opposed to long term career outcomes, the starting salaries are better in one field, and then so then based on that we construct different alternatives for majors and then finally make our decision. Okay, so that would be backward reasoning. Forward reasoning is typically goes hand in hand with system 2 decision making. Backward reasoning typically goes hand in hand with system 1 reasoning. Okay, and there's a reason for that, because system 1 is biased by the outcomes. Okay, but later on we'll also discuss examples or techniques such as backward induction. Okay, and we discuss those in the context of games, where that is the logical way to construct the trade-off between these alternatives, starting from the outcomes. But that doesn't mean you cannot start mapping the outcomes from the alternatives. That's the point. So once you draw this map, how do you then choose the alternatives? Then you can start from the back. You can start from the outcomes and work your way back. But what I'm talking about here is how we construct this map in the first place. So how we construct this map is system 2 leads us to construct the forward reasoning as the approach to construct this map, whereas system 1 would typically force us or would typically lead us to construct this map using backward reasoning. So that's the argument. Okay. All right. Then we had the PROACT model, where it focuses on, that's from the literature, that focuses on the, clarifying and defining the problem as best as we can, and then everything else is kind of subordinate to the problem definition. So based on the problem definition, we will search for the alternatives, we will construct the trade-offs, we will, of course, defining the objectives is sometimes considered part of the problem itself, and then the consequences or the outcomes. Okay, good. And we discussed satisficing. And all right, so that is yet another topic. And then we discussed why we make systematic errors. And if you look at the expected value criterion, which is simple to evaluate based on the probabilities, based on these risks. Okay, now the sum of these risks is the expected value. And where do we go wrong? And experts, Dan Gilbert and others have done research on this. They say we are not good at any of these elements, which is, excuse me, we typically tend to over or underestimate the outcomes, the evaluation of the outcomes, and also the probability of the outcomes. So that typically makes us individuals, humans, fairly poor decision makers. But on the other hand, we are at the top of the food chain, so we must be doing something right. And what is that something? Is that we have system 2. That's what differentiates us from chimps, let's say. Okay, but then we discussed the survey based on questions from Dr. Hans Rosling. Said, hey, chimps actually do better than some of the best trained, best educated humans. And why is that? Because humans haven't lost system 1. While we have gained system 2, we really haven't shed our system 1 behavior. And in other words, system 1 deploys very quickly, the associations kick in very quickly, and so therefore we have the biases. And what data have we seen most recently? And if you remember the What We Know of This World survey, we can't even beat the chimps, because the chimps will just spread their bets, right? If you have 3 options, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but we humans, because of the biases we have and because of the conditioning we may have, and then when we engage system 1, we make big mistakes. Okay, and so what are some systematic reasons? Anchoring trap, where we get anchored to the first piece of data, like a sale. Okay, and what are some techniques to limit anchoring? We discussed those. Status quo trap, where we don't like change. So think about climate change, and so we observe the effects of climate change, but we just can't change. We still want to fly, We still want to use fossil fuels. We still like to waste food, waste energy. We don't want to change our eating habits to be more sustainable. So in other words, human beings don't like change, okay, in their own lifetime, okay, and it takes a few generations to change, and we may not have that time, okay, especially as we deal with climate change effects. And that's the status quo trap. And then sunk cost trap is somewhat related to status quo, where we once we make a decision, we don't want to admit mistakes. And in other words, we don't want to go back, okay, and we want to save face in many cases. But other cases, we once we commit all of our resources, we feel like, oh my god, if we give up on this route, we may lose all of our resources, and at least if we stick to this path, we may come out ahead, or we may have fewer losses, okay. But that could be a fallacy, okay, and not in every circumstance, but in many circumstances. And because the early indications may have some truth to them, okay, hey, this project is not working in our favor. And then there's the confirming evidence trap, and where we cherry pick and we only look at the data that supports our view, okay, and we don't have a wide enough lens to seek out opposing points of view. And then there's the framing trap, where oftentimes we respond in our decisions to the way the problem is framed or the way the question is posed. And then you have the estimation and forecasting traps, where you have overconfidence or even underconfidence, which is called the prudence trap, okay, and or the recallability trap, where we make forecasting mistakes because um, we only remember the past few events, right? And in other words, and also we tend to conflate them, and so we tend to think, oh, because there's many more natural disasters, there must also be more loss of life, okay, and so those are examples of the recallability trap. And then we also discussed fallacies and errors at quite some length, and what are valid arguments, what are fallacious arguments, okay, fallacious forms. And I suggest you go back and review some of that discussion, and especially you can prove or disprove some of these using Venn diagrams, okay, and we discussed several examples in class. And one thing I'll make a note is the hypothetical syllogism. There's a good form as well as a fallacious form. Why does this show up in the fallacious column? Because it's often misused and abused. And so I showed you this ad. If you cut your cable, then you'll end up in the ditch, and you see, and so in other words, the linkages between these if-then arguments are not very strong. Okay, and so these are some examples of right fallacies, and that's important to know in the context of heuristics and biases, especially Kahneman's view of the world. Okay, and then the next topic we discussed was different problem types, and what's a good way to define the problem is to know whether it belongs to a class of problems that's already been solved before. And so you can think of generic problems where we always face them, okay, it's just showing up in a different form, but it's really the same problem, okay. And then you have generic problem first exposure, where think of COVID-19, that would be a good example. Epidemics are generic. There's a lot of viruses, a lot of bacteria in the world, and there's more biomass and bacteria and viruses than the entire animal kingdom, animal species, all the animal species put together. So that's a generic problem. We always will continue to also experience this, but this every strain of virus that jumps species, that's the first exposure. Okay, and some people think it's a unique event, but it's not. It's happens periodically in history, maybe not in our lifetime, but it happens. And so there's data on that. So you can go back and look at solution methods that worked in the 2003 SARS crisis, and the 1957 flu epidemic, and then the Spanish flu epidemic, okay, of the 1918 era. And then of course you can have a new generic problem. Now, some people argue, oh, isn't a new generic problem a generic problem? Yes, but it's different in the sense that generic problems, you already have a template, whereas new generic problems are now unique, but you know they're going to become generic in the future. So you're going to have the same issue cropping up over and over again. Climate change is a good example. There are many unique effects that are completely new to this century, okay, or even the last 50 years. But then these problems are going to recur in different ways, on a consistent basis, as long as we don't fix these underlying issues. So it becomes a new generic problem, okay? And let's say also take nuclear conflict. That's a unique event when it happened first. Okay, that's not generic. That's a unique event. But from that, now it's a new generic problem where there's the potential for nuclear conflict ever present. There's many nuclear powers, and that's a new generic problem. How to tackle that? Okay, and a unique event becomes a recurring event. That's what you call a new generic problem. It takes on the status of a generic problem. Okay, good. So generic problems require a policy framework, non-proliferation treaty. Let's say for nuclear powers. Okay, and so that's a policy framework. Okay, whereas unique events require planning and action. Okay, so during the World War, they were worried that Germany might get nuclear weapons, and so they had a planning and action framework to develop, the nuclear bomb. And then because the U.S. developed the first nuclear bomb, Russia then reacted to that and said, okay, that's a unique problem. Now our adversary has a nuclear weapon, and then they started developing their own nuclear weapons. And so that was the first effort, unique effort. Okay, unique problem, how to do this. And like major inventions are truly unique. Those decisions related to major innovations, inventions, they are unique. Okay, and so you need a planning and action framework, a project approach, if you will, around that. Okay, and so there's some more granularity there here. For a generic, but first exposure, I should say. Okay, so if you want to think of this, first exposure. Okay, and so then you need to identify the right plan of action. So think of it that way. Okay, and then of course there are these common decision fallacies as it relates to these problem types and how we solve the problems. We often reinvent the wheel when we don't need to. It's a generic problem. We look for a quick win, okay, where really you need to think about not only how you'll solve it today, but in the future as well. We solve the wrong problem. We are not good at choosing the right generic problem that fits the circumstances. We avoid the decision, solve the easier problem, let's say. We also egocentric, thinking, oh, this problem only pertains to us, okay, and so no, this problem affects everybody in your group or everybody in your university or everybody in the world. Okay, and so I'll give you some examples on this. So let's see. Then there's the utility theory that's fairly important, where in general, the more we have of something, the less we value the increment of that something. Okay, so if you already have a lot of wealth, an additional 1,000 USD or 8,000 HKD is not that much of an impact. And so you might say, I don't want to take on additional responsibilities at work just for that salary increment. Okay, but for somebody who makes much less, that additional $1,000 or 8,000 Hong Kong salary increment might be well worth it. Okay, and in other words, there's diminishing returns to scale. This is what we call, as the scale increases, there's diminishing returns to utility on that scale. Alrighty, so that was yet another topic. And then we looked at critical thinking skills and how that's a vital part of system 2, and how critical thinking is like learning, really. Okay, and then of course, once we learn about it enough, then it kind of transfers over to system 1, where the critical thinking is incorporated into our hardwired, as they say, into our system 1 decision making processes. Okay, and critical thinking means being skeptical and always recognizing the flaws in the argument, but also in our own arguments. Okay? And again here it's based on logic, but logic is only part of it. Where we talked about induction, which is you're making a broader conclusion from a specific set of premises, versus deduction, where this is where you use logic. Okay, all these logical constructs you would use here, where you go from general premises to specific conclusions. Okay, and the important point being that deductive arguments are either valid or invalid because of the logical connection. But independently, if the premises are false or unacceptable, why unacceptable? Because it may not be provably false, but we reject it, okay, as common sense. Then it leads to unsound arguments, okay, like the earth is flat. Okay, I can't, we couldn't prove it, but over time we realized that it was actually unsound. And then, of course, you had the Foucault's pendulum experiment and many other experiments that showed, hey, the earth is actually round. And so deductive arguments are either valid or invalid based on the logical connection. And then if the premises here, we're taking some license, they all not only refer to the antecedents or the assumptions, but also the conclusions. Okay, and even we discussed examples where the conclusion is wrong or conclusion is false, or even the assumptions could be false. Okay? Like all pigs fly, something like that. And then on the other hand, if you're making inductive arguments, they're either strong or weak because, so if you remember, induction starts from general premises. Induction starts from specific premises, and you're drawing a general conclusion. Where the general conclusion, you may not be able to prove it, okay, but you prove it with high likelihood, which makes it strong and reliable, okay, or you prove it with low likelihood, which then makes it a weak induction, okay. And even here, if the premises are either false or unacceptable, then it's an unreliable inductive argument. Okay, so hopefully we make more valid and then ultimately sound deductive arguments and strong inductive arguments. And that's typically what critical thinking and system 2, it's a learned kind of behavior. Okay, and then over time, system 1, we make logical decisions using system 1. Okay, once we learn enough. Okay, good. So the key point being that system 2 is like learning, classic example of learning. Okay, and then we discussed some examples of this and how even interactions in social groups, in businesses, that's a learned skill. And so how can we deploy some of these logical rules to train us and to identify what are the flaws in the thinking, what are behaviors. And so for that we looked at the cash in the hat game, and where it's a sequential game. You can observe, player 2 can observe what player 1 is doing, and player 2 only has to decide after player 1 decides. Player 1 models a lender, player 2 models a borrower. And there are 3 choices for player 1, and then player 2 can either match that investment, or they can just cheat, not make any investment of their own. And then we discuss the potential for moral hazard, how to compare these different decision alternatives. We look at the payoffs. Okay, for example, why doesn't player 1 want to invest more in the venture? Because player 2 has moral hazard. Or player 2 might say, if I cheat, if I don't put in any effort, I'm actually better off getting $1.5. On the other hand, if I cooperate and match the investment, I'm only getting $1. And because player 1 can predict player 2's decision making, player 1 is likely to say, okay, I don't want to end up getting 0. I would rather invest less and get at least 0.5. Okay, because that's kind of the best response of player 2. If player 1 invests $1, $1 beats 0.5 for player 2, so they will match it. And so both of them are happy here, but that's not necessarily the best solution. That's the Nash equilibrium, but it's not the best solution. Because overall as an economy, you're only making $1.50 profit, whereas you could be making $2.50. And so how to counter that? We discussed a couple of ways to counter it. Maybe you could share some of that benefit. Okay, and we discussed examples of that where player one could say, okay, we'll share the $2.50, where you can keep this $1.50 out of the 2.5, and I'll keep one. And now the problem here is, of course, player two gets the same outcome either way. And that's what we call as indifference. They're indifferent between matching or not matching. So have you really resolved moral hazard? And the answer is half the time. And half the time may still be good enough. Just the same way as banks give out loans, knowing that some fraction of them are going to be bad loans. That's fine. Okay. And so we have to look at, on an expected basis, are we better off? Expected value criterion, if you remember, Bernoulli's framework. And so now for player one, what's the expected payoff? Half the time they're getting $1, half the time they're getting 0. And so in other words, their expected payoff is 0.5. But is it better than investing $1? Yeah. And so if they're getting 0.5 and here it's 0.5, even they will randomize. So half the time they will not invest, half the time they will invest in big amounts, and half the time they will invest less, half the time they'll invest more. In other words, their expected payoff is 0.5. And what's the expected payoff for player two? Half the time they're getting $1, half the time they're getting 1.5. So in other words, expected payoff for player two is actually 1.25, and expected payoff for player one is 0.5. Okay, and so in other words, have we really achieved? Have we eliminated moral hazard? Not entirely, but half the time. Okay, and that might still, or even more than half the time, if you think about when player one is randomizing. So in other words, we do see the evils of moral hazard, but it's not like the player one is dumb and player one is being too altruistic. They're making decisions for their own best interest, and somehow this works out better than a situation which always leads to moral hazard. Okay? That's real life. Is there cheating? Yes, there's always cheating out there in the real world. But does that prevent banks from lending money? Does that prevent borrowers from applying for loans? Not so much. Okay, and the point is, you learn to play the odds. That's the power of randomizing. Good. So that was what we learned from the cash in the hat game. And so this is an example of logical thinking, and also brings in elements of risk. Okay. And then we also discussed analytics as a vehicle for system 2, where in analytics we're breaking down bigger problems into smaller problems. Okay, and where system 1 might short circuit and say, okay, I'm going to substitute this bigger problem for a really small problem. System 2 breaks it down into these smaller problems, solves these smaller problems, and then brings it back together. Synthetical thinking. And so examples like tic-tac-toe, like I described in my recorded lecture before, and heuristic methods. We learn heuristic methods over time solving these problems. Okay, I immediately know that if I've played tic-tac-toe more than a few times, I know I should never start out of the corner unless I'm playing with an opponent who doesn't know how to play. Then I might win. But if the opponent is as smart as us, we always start out at the center, okay? Because there are more wins possible from the center than from the corner or the sides. Okay, and then we also learned about optimization techniques. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But here's another example where we apply the rules of logic and comparison of alternatives for this project. We say, okay, what's the minimum time to complete the project? What's the earliest we can finish it? It is not just the sum of the times. That would be system 1 thinking, but rather we break it down, into smaller subproblems and then solve it. Okay, so once we map it out, then we see there are 4 paths. There are 4 paths from A to G, and A, B, D, E, G, A, B, D, F, G, A, C, E, G, A, C, F, G. And then we say, okay, what's the longest path among these? Because I have to complete all the tasks, and the longest path is the minimum time I need to complete the project. Okay, so in other words, the longest of the paths is the minimum time to complete the project. And so that's the synthesis going on. Okay, so we break it down into these different paths, and then we bring it back together using logic, saying, okay, now, the soonest I can complete it is the longest path time. Okay, and that's the idea that I wanted to illustrate through this example. And so here's the illustration. Out of these 4 paths, 2 of them are critical in the sense that they are the longest paths, and which means what? Further understanding is I cannot be late on any of these tasks, A, B, C, D, F, and G. But E, I can afford to be a bit late because it's not on any of the longest paths, which means even if I'm late on this by 3 days, I could still complete the project on time. Okay, and so that was yet another example. Okay? And so the prisoner's dilemma is very simple. It's a simultaneous as opposed to a sequential game. And so in prisoner's dilemma, let's say that you are playing against an opponent. You assume both of you are rational, and if you cooperate, play black cards, both of you, then both of you get 3 points each. But if you cooperate, play black, and the opponent plays red, then it's like they take 2 points from you. Whereas if you cooperate, you're giving 3 points to the other player. So in other words, the opponent ends up getting 5, you get only 0. Okay, and so it's symmetric. So it's the same that applies to the payoff for the opposing player. Okay, and so what do we take away is that now we can get a glimpse of a strategy. Okay, so if you now break up the analysis into these smaller problems, okay, what would I do? What's in my best interest if the column player plays black? My best interest is, okay, if I cheat, I get 5 points. If I cooperate, I only get 3. Okay, so that's the smaller problem. On the other hand, let's take the other sub-problem. If the column player plays red, again, same situation, I get 2 extra points from cheating, 2 versus 0. And so now how to synthesize? Synthesis says, no matter what the column player does, it's in my interest to cheat. And now if you look at the column player, it's the same argument for them. No matter what you do, it's in their interest to cheat. And this is the basis for game theory. And now as a synthesis, putting it all together, we say, what's my best response to anything what the column player does is to cheat. What's their best response to my best response if I cheat? Obviously, if I cheat, if I play red, then for the column player 2 beats 0, they cheat. Okay, or it's in their best interest to cheat. It's happening as a simultaneous game, but if you think about it, if you analyze it, let's say using system 2, you will come to this conclusion. Okay, cheating in this setting is more favorable. Favorable in the sense of this is the most likely outcome if you assume rational actors. Okay, is it the best interest for both parties taken together? Not quite. But the interesting objective is these are all individual interests, rational individual self-interest at work. Okay. Now this is if you play with a random partner, if you increase the cooperation payoffs, it's still the same dominant strategy. The dominant strategy is still to cheat. Why? Because 10 beats 8, 2 beats 0. Okay, and so that's still the dominant strategy. Okay. And no matter what the opposing player does, dominant strategy says, no matter what the opponent does, what's my best strategy? Okay, so you could also have weakly dominant, where it is the best strategy if the opponent does X, but if the opponent does Y, then it's the same either way. Okay, so that would be called weakly dominant. And then if you play repeatedly, now there we saw that there could be some benefit to cooperation. Okay, and if you play 2 times, okay, and you can see that there could be some potential benefits, more benefits to cooperation. And so if you're using system 1 decision making here, that might lead you to say, okay, I'll cooperate the first time, and then the next time I'll cheat. Okay, but if you're purely rational, you would still argue that, hey, and I showed you in class how this works out, where if you work your way back using backward induction, that, hey, 4-4, which is cheating both times, is still the Nash equilibrium. Okay, but then the point is here, there's more scenarios where you could be better off than 4-4. Okay, So we're just getting 4 points. But then there are other scenarios, many other decision sequences where you may end up with 16, 8, 18, 10, 12, okay? And so what does that do? If we don't think about it rationally, we might say, or strictly rationally, I should say, if we believe the opponent may not be strictly rational, it leads us to outcomes that are actually in the best interest of both parties, where both of the parties are better off than 4-4. And so this is an illustration of why we say that system 2 is not always better, where some beliefs and some trust, which are emotional kind of judgments, they can have some positive outcomes associated with them. Okay, so that's the point. And so somebody asked me, so what's the best solution from a rational perspective in the Nash equilibrium? That we're not saying that's the best solution. From a purely rational perspective, 4-4, in other words, cheating both times you play the game, that is still the Nash equilibrium. That is still the predicted outcome, but obviously what's in the best interest of both parties, that's 16 and 16. And repetitive behaviors or repeated engagements may lead to more cooperative behaviors. That's the point. Okay, and potentially lead to more cooperative behaviors. Okay, good. And then lastly, we discussed optimization techniques, and so here, if you think about, we discussed the bakery example. You could bake different types of cake. We discussed that at quite some length. But then also consider this example where, let's say that you have a business making furniture, and you're making tables and chairs, and you get profit. You have to decide how many tables and chairs you have to make every day, and you get $20 profit margin per table, $15 profit margin per chair. And what are the resources you need to make these tables and chairs? You need components, and there are two types of components, large and small. And so a table requires 2 large and 2 small components. Okay, think of these Lego pieces if you want. And a chair requires 1 large and 2 small components. And the problem is we only have limited resources, only 6 large and 8 small components. Okay, so how many tables and chairs should we make? Okay, and how to solve this? Of course, here you can again break it down into these different alternatives. Okay, so again, think of an optimization problem has 3 elements. The objective function, here in this case, maximize profits from making a certain number of tables, certain number of chairs. Then you have the decision variables, which are the number of tables and chairs you can make. And then finally, the constraints. Here, the constraints relate to how many components we have. Okay, while making these chairs and tables, we cannot exceed a number whereby we exhaust or exceed the available number of components, okay, either of the large type or small type. And so then we can construct an optimization problem like this. Say x1 is the number of tables, x2 is the number of chairs, $20 per table profit, $15 per chair profit. And what are the constraints? Of course, decision variables are x1 and x2. What are the constraints? That I only have 8, if you remember, I only have 8 small components, where a table requires 2 small and a chair requires 2 small. In other words, 2x1 plus 2x2 less than equal to 8, 2x1 plus x2 less than equal to 6. And if you look at this problem, you can solve this graphically. And of course, you could draw the y-axis, which is x2, x-axis, so-called x-axis, the horizontal axis, which is x1, and so here then you can start drawing these constraints, where we say, okay, what is 2x1 plus 2x2 less than equal to 8? That is this line, okay, the blue line here, and because that's symmetric, and that is the first constraint. And because the horizontal axis intercept is x1 equals 4, by setting this equals to 0, you would get, setting this equals to 8 rather, And by setting x2 equals 0, which means that the vertical axis component is 0, now we say x1 equals 4. Okay. Similarly, x2 equals 4. Okay. And so that's this line. And that's this line. And what's the large component constraint? You only have 6 large pieces. Each table requires 2. Each chair requires 1. And that is this red line. Obviously, that's not symmetric. And what does that say? You can make up to 6 chairs if you did not make any tables. Okay. And you could make only 3 tables even if you didn't make any chairs when x2 equals 0. And so now we want to solve this problem. Obviously, we are in the positive quadrant, x1, x2 greater than 0. And now what we're looking for is the best direction of improvement of profit. And that is this line, 20x1 plus 15x2. And this, as you can see, is slope is greater than 45 degrees because it's weighted more towards x1 if you think about it. Okay. And in other words, the objective function is increasing faster in the x1 value than it is in the x2 value. Okay? And so therefore, it's increasing in this direction. So how far can you go? And the interesting thing is if you set it up as a linear programming problem where you allow for fractional values of x1 and x2, it's not just integer values, then it works out really in our favor where the optimal solution is always in one of these corner points. Okay. So this point is obviously not going to be optimal. It's either this point, or this point. And you can see based on the direction that it's going to be this point that's the optimal. Okay. Why? Because you're trying to go as far as you can in this feasible space. The feasible space you get by the intersection of all the constraints. Okay, so you have to have this constraint satisfied, which means the number of small components you consume should be less than or equal to 8, which means all the points to the left and below. Similarly, all the points to the left and below. If you intersect these sets, you get this polygon, if you will. And so that is this beige shaded area. And you're going as far as you can within this beige shaded area in this direction. And that's what leads you to this point being optimal. What is that point? You can easily solve. You can see that it's actually 2 and 2. Okay. So if you make 2 tables and 2 chairs, then you have satisfied this constraint. It's on the blue line. And if you make 2 tables and 2 chairs, 2x1 is 4, x2 is 2. So you used up all of your large components as well. Okay. And in other words, 2 and 2 solves this problem. Good. And so that's what we call as a binding constraint, where at the solution, optimal solution, you've used up all your resources. That's a binding constraint. So if you're the large component constraint is binding, the small component constraint is also binding. Okay, and so both constraints are binding. In which case you will encounter some shadow price. So that's also an added concept. Shadow price is how much would you be willing to pay to get an additional large component or an additional small component at this solution. And the answer is that's clearly positive, right? Where I would like to get more resources, okay, and in order to improve my profits even further. And then I believe in the lecture video, I had also talked about these so-called assignment problems where we are trying to solve. These tend to be more complex because these tend to be binary decisions, and there's easily many different configurations of these binary decisions. So here's a simple example. You have trucks, 4 trucks. You're trying to assign it across different regions in Hong Kong. So where you can only send a truck any given day to one region, and any given region can only be supplied by 1 truck. And here's the cost of each assignment. And so how would you go about making the best possible assignments where each truck gets only 1 region and each region gets only 1 truck? And your objective is to minimize the total cost of the assignment. And the way you can solve it is, in this simple case, we can show that actually the greedy heuristic is not so bad. Greedy heuristic searches for the best next assignment. Okay, so the next best assignment, if you will. So let's start with the least cost assignment over all the possible assignments. And the least cost assignment, I believe, is 400. Okay, and where you say, okay, I want to assign truck 3 to Lantau and get this benefit right away. Okay, and then what's the next cheapest assignment, I believe, is truck 1 to Kowloon. Okay, that's 430. And then I believe the next best, now you have to compare only across these two columns, which is the cheapest. And next cheapest would be 460, but it's already taken up, okay, by Lantau. Truck 3 is already taken up by Lantau, in which case I believe the cheapest would be 500. And then the only assignment you can make then is truck 4 to New Territories. And if you add up these numbers, you will find that this actually is the best solution. Okay, even though you ended up with the last territory, the options are actually, you would have preferred to have truck 1 for new territory, but you save more money by reserving truck 1 for Kowloon. Okay, and so in other words, greedy can be your friend. Okay, greedy heuristics. Okay, and going back to Kahneman's ideas. Okay, and a lot of times this is how we solve complex problems, using greedy heuristics. Give me the best possible solution right now. And greedy also is not bad when we are looking at even more trucks, five trucks and 5 assignments. Okay, and 5 regions, where each truck can only get assigned to one region. Each region gets only 1 truck. Okay, so here the same way you would do greedy is you would start out looking for the cheapest solution, which I believe is again 400, and then you scan these 4 columns, and then the next cheapest solution again is 430, and then the next cheapest solution is, now you compare across a New Territory, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen columns, and then you say, okay, 460 is already taken up, so which might be the next cheapest? I believe that would be 450. Okay, and then you take that, and then you compare across these 2 columns, which is the next best solution. I believe that would be 500. And then now you're left with the last, the only possible one is 980. And then of course here you can compare, what if you switch these assignments, and if you want you can open up an Excel file and do it there. Okay, and so greedy gets you pretty close to the optimal solution, is the main point. Now, not in all circumstances. Sometimes greedy can lead to bad answers, but in many instances, and because we have limited resources to make these decisions, not every business has sophisticated analytics software that can perform these computations. And in other words, greedy can be our friend. Heuristics in particular can be our friend, especially if they're smart heuristics. And where do we learn these smart heuristics? From System 1 and well-trained System 1. So where you learn these methods over time and then you deploy them as heuristics. Okay. So good. Hopefully this review helped. And then the one topic I didn't review was the pirate game. I encourage you to go back and discuss that. That should be very fresh. We just discussed it last week. Okay, and I would also encourage everybody to look into that game that we played and the key insights from that game, especially the backwards induction, solving nested subproblems. Again, a perfect example of analytics and how we solve the smallest subproblem, use that solution in the next bigger problem, and work our way back. Okay, and it's not unlike what we're doing here. Okay, it's not quite unlike. In fact, dynamic programming and backwards induction is actually one way you can solve complex assignment problems as well. Okay, alrighty. So hopefully you found this review useful. We'll see you all later. Thank you so much.